Chapter 7. My, said a voice from behind them, and the Baudelaire orphans turned to find Stefano standing there, the black suitcase with the shiny silver padlock in his hands and a look of Brummagem surprise on his face. Brummagem is a rare word for fake that even Klaus didn't know what it meant, but the children did not have to be told that Stefano was pretending to be surprised. What a terrible accident has happened here, snakebite. Whoever discovers this will be most upset. You, Violet began to say, but her throat fluttered, as if the fact of Uncle Monty's death were food that tasted terrible. You, she said again. Stefano took no notice. Of course, after they discover that Dr. Montgomery is dead, they'll wonder what became of those repulsive orphans he had lying around the house. But they'll be long gone. Speaking of which, it's time to leave. The Prospero sails at 5 o'clock from Hazy Harbor, and I'd like to be the first passenger aboard. That way I'll have time for a bottle of wine before lunch. How could you? Klaus whispered hoarsely. He couldn't take his eyes off of Uncle Monty's pale, pale face. How could you do this? How could you murder him? Why, Klaus, I'm surprised, Stefano said, and walked over to Uncle Monty's body. A smarty pants boy like you should be able to figure out that your chubby old uncle died from a snake bite, not from murder. Look at those teeth marks. Look at his pale, pale face. Look at those staring eyes. Stop it, Violet said. Don't talk like that. You're right, Stefano said. There's no time for chit-chat. We have a ship to catch. Let's go. We're not going anywhere with you, Klaus said. His face was pinched with the effort of focusing on their predicament rather than going to pieces. We will stay here until the police come. And how do you suppose the police will know to come? Stefano says. We will call them, Klaus says, in what hoped was a firm tone of voice, and began to walk towards the door. Stefano dropped his suitcase, the shiny silver padlock making a clattering sound as it hit the marble floor. He took a few steps and blocked Klaus's way, his eyes wide and red with fury. I am so tired, Stefano snarled, of having to explain everything to you. You're supposed to be so very smart, and yet you always seem to forget about this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the jagged knife. This is my knife. It is very sharp and very eager to hurt you. Almost as eager as I am. If you don't do what I say, you will suffer bodily harm. Is that clear enough for you? Now get in the damn Jeep. It is, as you know, very, very rude and usually unnecessary to use profanity, but the Baudelaire orphans were too tired to point this out to Stefano. Taking a last look at their poor Uncle Monty, the three children followed Stefano to the door of the reptile room to get in the Jeep. To add insult to injury, a phrase which here means forcing somebody to do an unpleasant task when they're already very upset, Stefano forced Violet to carry his suitcase out of the house. But she was too lost in her own thoughts to care. She was remembering the last conversation she and her siblings had with Uncle Monty and thinking with a cold rush of shame that it hadn't really been a conversation at all. You'll recall, of course, that on the ride home from seeing zombies in the snow, the children had been so worried about Stefano they hadn't said a word to Uncle Monty, and that when the Jeep had arrived at the house, the Baudelaire orphans had dashed upstairs to hash out the situation without even saying good night to the man who now lay dead under a sheet in the reptile room. As the youngsters reached the Jeep, Violet tried to remember if they had even thanked him for taking them to the movies. But the night was all a blur. She thought that she, Klaus, and Sonny was probably said, "Thank you, Uncle Monty," when they were standing together at the ticket booth, but she couldn't be sure. Stefano opened the door of the Jeep and gestured with the knife, ushering Klaus and Sonny into the tiny back seat, and Violet, the black suitcase heavy on her lap, into the front seat behind him. The orphans had a brief hope that the engine would not start when Stefano turned the key in the ignition, but this was a futile hope. Uncle Monty took care of his Jeep, and it started right up. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny looked behind them as Stefano began to drive alongside the snake-shaped hedges. At the sight of the reptile room, which Uncle Monty had filled so carefully with his specimens, and in which he was now a sort of specimen himself, the weight of the Baudelaire's despair was too much for them, and they quietly began to cry. It is a curious thing, the death of a loved one. We all know that our time in this world is limited, and that eventually all of us will end up underneath some sheet, never to wake up. And yet, it is always a surprise when it happens to someone we know. It is like walking up the stairs to your bedroom in the dark and thinking there is one more stair than there is. Your foot falls down through the air, and there's a sickly moment of dark surprise as you try to readjust the way you thought of things. The Baudelaire orphans were crying not only for their Uncle Monty, but for their own parents, in this dark and curious feeling of falling that accompanies any great loss. What has to happen to them? Stefano has heartlessly slaughtered the man who was supposed to be watching over the Baudelaires, and now they were all alone. What would Stefano do to them? He was supposed to be left behind when they went to Peru, and now he would be leaving with them on the Prospero. And what terrible things would happen in Peru? Would anybody rescue them in there? Would Stefano get his hands on the fortune? And what would happen to the 3 children afterward? These are frightening questions, and if you are thinking about such matters, they require your full attention. And the orphans were so immersed in thinking about them, they didn't realize that Stefano was about to collide with another automobile until the moment of impact. There was a horrible tearing sound of the metal and glass as a black car crashed into Uncle Monty's Jeep, throwing the children to the floor with a jarring thump that felt as though it left the both of their stomachs up on the seat. The black suitcase lurched into Violet's shoulder and then forward into the windshield, which immediately cracked in a dozen places so it looked like a spider web. Stefano gave a cry of surprise and turned the steering wheel this way and that, but the 2 vehicles were locked together and another thump veered off the road into a small pile of mud. It is a rare occurrence when a car accident can be called a stroke of good fortune, but that was most certainly the case here. With the snake-shaped hedges still clearly visible behind them, the Baudelaire's journey toward Hazy Harbor had stopped. Stefano gave another sharp cry, this one of rage. "Blasted!" he shouted, as Violet rubbed her shoulder to make sure she wasn't seriously hurt. Klaus and Sonny got up cautiously from the Jeep floor and looked out the cracked windshield. There appeared to be only one person in the other car, but it was hard to tell, as the vehicle had clearly suffered more damage than Monty's Jeep. Its entire front had pleated itself together like an accordion, and one hubcap was spinning noisily on the pavement of Lousy Lane, making blurry circles as if it were a giant coin somebody had dropped. The driver was dressed in gray and making a rough hacking sound as he opened the crumpled door in car and struggled his way out. He made the hacking sound again, and then he reached into a pocket of his suit and pulled out a white handkerchief. "It's Mr. Poe," Klaus cried. It was Mr. Poe, coughing away as usual, and the children were so delighted to see him that they found themselves smiling despite their horrible circumstances. Mr. Poe, Violet cried, reaching around Stefano's suitcase to open the passenger door. Stefano reached an arm and grabbed her sore shoulder, turning his head slowly so that each child saw his shiny eyes. "This changes nothing," he hissed at them. "This is a bit of bad luck for you, but this is your last. The 3 of you will be back in this car with me and heading toward Hazy Harbor in time to catch the Prospero, I promise you." "We'll see about that," Violet replied, opening the door and sliding out beneath the suitcase. Klaus opened the door and followed her, carrying Sonny. Mr. Poe. "Violet?" Mr. Poe asked. "Violet Baudelaire, is that you?" "Yes, Mr. Poe," Violet said. "It's all of us, and we're so grateful to run into you like this." "Well, I wouldn't say that," Mr. Poe said. "This was clearly the other driver's fault. You ran into me." "How dare you!" Stefano shouted and got out of the car himself, wrinkling his nose at the smell of horseradish that filled the air. He stomped over to where Mr. Poe was standing, but halfway there the children saw his face change from one of pure rage to one of brummagem, confusion, and sadness. "I'm sorry," he said in a high, fluttery voice. "This whole thing is my fault. I'm so distressed by what has happened that I wasn't paying any attention to the rules of the road. I hope you're not hurt, Mr. Foe." "It's Poe," Mr. Poe said. "My name is Poe. I'm not hurt, luckily. It looks like nobody was hurt. I wish the same could be said for my car. But who are you, and what are you doing with the Baudelaire children?" "I'll tell you who he is," Klaus said. Please, Klaus," Mr. Poe astonished, a word which here means reprimanded Klaus, even though he was interrupting for a very good reason. "It is not polite to interrupt." "My name is Stefano," Stefano said, shaking Mr. Poe's hand. I was Dr. Montgomery's assistant." "What do you mean, was?" Mr. Poe asked sternly. "Were you fired?" "No, Dr. Montgomery. Oh, excuse me." Stefano turned away and pretended to dab his eyes as if it were too sad to continue. Facing away from Mr. Poe, he gave the orphans a big wink before continuing. "I'm sorry to tell you that there's been a horrible accident, Mr. Doe. Dr. Montgomery is dead." "Poe," Mr. Poe said. "He's dead? That's terrible. What happened?" "I don't know," Stefano said. "It looks like a snake bite to me. I don't know anything about snakes. That's why I was going to town to get a doctor. The children seemed too upset to be left alone." "He's not taking us to get a doctor," Klaus shouted. "He's taking us to Peru." "You see what I mean?" Stefano said to Mr. Poe, patting Klaus's head. "The children are obviously very distressed. Dr. Montgomery is going to take them to Peru today." "Yes, I know," Mr. Poe said. "That's why I hurried over here this morning to finally bring them their luggage. Klaus, I know you're confused and upset over this accident. Please try to understand that if Dr. Montgomery is really dead, the expedition is canceled." But Mr. Poe, Klaus said indignantly. Please, Mr. Poe said. This is a matter for adults to discuss, Klaus. Clearly, a doctor needs to be called. Well, why don't you drive on up to the house, Stefano said, and I'll take the children to find a doctor. Jose, Sonny shrieked, which probably meant something like, no way. Why don't we all go to the house, Mr. Poe said, and call for a doctor? Stefano blinked, and for a second his face grew angry again before he was able to calm himself and answer smoothly. Of course, he said. I should have called earlier. Obviously, I'm not thinking clearly as you. Here, children, get my Jeep, and Mr. Poe will follow us. We're not getting back in the car with you, Klaus said firmly. Please, Klaus, Mr. Poe said, try to understand. There's been a serious accident. All other discussions will have to be put aside. The only trouble is, I'm not sure my car will start. It's very smashed up. Try the ignition, Stefano said. Mr. Poe nodded and walked back into a car. He sat in the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine made a rough, wet noise. It sounded quite a bit like Mr. Poe's coughs, but it did not start. I'm afraid the engine is quite dead, Mr. Poe called out. And before long, Stefano muttered to the children, you will be too. I'm sorry, Mr. Poe said. I couldn't hear you. Stefano smiled. I said that's too bad. Well, why don't I take the orphans back to the house and you walk behind us? There isn't room for everyone. Mr. Poe frowned. But the children's suitcases are here. I don't want to leave them unattended. Why don't we put the luggage in your car and the children and I will walk back to the house? Stefano frowned. Well, one of the children should ride with me so I don't get lost. Mr. Poe smiled. But you can see the house from here. You won't get lost. Stefano doesn't want us to go alone with you, Violet said, finally speaking up. She had been waiting for the proper moment to make her case. He's afraid that we'll tell you who he really is and what he's really up to. What's she talking about? Mr. Poe asked Stefano. I have no idea, Mr. Toe, Stefano replied, shaking his head and looking at Violet fiercely. Violet took a deep breath. This man is not Stefano, she said, pointing at him. He's Count Olaf, and he's here to take us away. Who am I? Stefano asked. What am I doing? Mr. Poe looked Stefano up and down and then shook his head. Forgive the children, he said. They are very upset. Count Olaf is a terrible man who tried to steal their money, and the youngsters are very frightened of him. Do I look like this Count Olaf? Stefano asked, his eyes shining. No, you don't, Mr. Poe said. Count Olaf had one long eyebrow and a clean-shaven face. You have a beard, and if you don't mind me saying so, no eyebrows at all. He shaved his eyebrow, Violet said, and grew a beard. Anyone can see that. And he has the tattoo, Klaus cried. The eye tattoo on his ankle. Look at the tattoo. Mr. Poe looked at Stefano and shrugged. Shrugged. I'm sorry to ask you this, he said, but the children seem so upset, and before we discuss anything further, I'd like to set their minds at ease. Would you mind showing me your ankle? I'd be happy to, Stefano said, giving the children a toothy smile. Right or left? Klaus closed his eyes and thought for a second. Left, he said. Stefano placed his left foot on the bumper of Uncle Monty's Jeep. Looking at the Baudelaire orphans with his shiny, shiny eyes, he began to raise the leg of his stained, striped pants. Violet, Klaus, Sonny, and Mr. Poe all kept their eyes on Stefano's ankle. The pant leg went up, like a curtain rising to begin a play, but there was no tattoo of an eye to be seen. The Baudelaire orphans stared at a patch of smooth skin, as blank and pale as poor Uncle Monty's face. Chapter 8. While the Jeep sputtered ahead of them, the Baudelaire orphans trudged back toward Uncle Monty's house, the scent of horseradish in their nostrils and a feeling of frustration in their hearts. It is very unnerving to be proven wrong, particularly when you are really right about the person who is really wrong is the one who is proving you wrong and proving themselves wrongly right? I don't know how to get rid of this tattoo. I don't know how he got rid of his tattoo, Klaus says stubbornly to Mr. Poe, who was coughing into his handkerchief. But that's definitely Count Olaf. Klaus, Mr. Poe said when he stopped coughing, this is getting very tiresome. Going over this again and again, we have just seen Stefano's embellished ankle. Embellished means we know what embellished means, Klaus said, watching Stefano get out of Uncle Monty's Jeep and walk quickly into the house. Without tattoos. But it is Count Olaf. Why can't you see it? All I can see, Mr. Poe said, is what's in front of me. I see a man with no eyebrows, a beard, and no tattoo, and that's not Count Olaf. Anyway, even by some chance that Stefano wishes you harm, you have nothing to fear. It is quite shocking that Dr. Montgomery is dead, but we're simply not going to hand over you and your fortune to his assistant. Why, this man can't even remember my name. Klaus looked at his siblings and sighed. It would be easier, they realized, to argue with the snake-shaped hedge that with Mr. Poe when he had made up his mind. Violet was about to try reasoning with him one more time when a horn honked behind them. The Baudelaires and Mr. Poe got out of the way of the approaching automobile, a small gray car with a very skinny driver. The car stopped in front of the house, and the skinny person got out, a tall man in a white coat. May we help you, Mr. Poe called? As he and the children approached. I am Dr. Lucafont, the tall man said, pointing at himself with a big, solid hand. I received a call that there's been a terrible accident involving a snake. You're here already? Mr. Poe asked, but Stefano has scarcely had time to call, let alone for you to drive here. I believe that speed is of the essence in an emergency. Don't you? Dr. Lucafont said. If an autopsy is to be performed, it should be done immediately. Of course, Mr. Poe said quickly. I was just surprised. Where is the body? Dr. Lucafont asked, walking towards the door. Stefano can tell you, Mr. Poe said, opening the door of the house. Stefano was waiting in the entryway, holding a coffee pot. I'm going to make some coffee, he said. Who wants some? I'll have a cup, Dr. Lucafont said. Nothing like a hearty cup of coffee before starting the day's work. Mr. Poe frowned. Shouldn't you take a look at Dr. Montgomery first? Yes, Dr. Lucafont, Stefano said. Time is of the essence in an emergency, don't you think? Yes, I suppose you're right, Dr. Lucafont said. Poor Dr. Montgomery in the reptile room, Stefano said, gesturing to where the Baudelaire's guardian still lay. Please do a thorough examination, and then you may have some coffee. You're the boss, Dr. Lucafont said, opening the door of the reptile room with an oddly stiff hand. Stefano led Mr. Poe into the kitchen, and the Baudelaire's glumly followed. When one feels useless and unable to help, one can use the expression feeling like a fifth wheel, because if something has four wheels, such as a wagon or a car, there is no real need for a fifth. As Stefano brewed coffee for the adults, the three children sat down at the kitchen table where they had first had coconut cake with Uncle Monty just a short time ago, and Violet, Klaus, and Sunny felt like the fifth, sixth, and seventh wheels in a car that was going the wrong direction, toward Hazy Harbor and the departing Prospero. When I spoke to Dr. Lucafont on the phone, Stefano said, I told him about the accident with your car. When he has done his medical examination, he will drive you into town to get a mechanic, and I will stay here with the orphans. No, Klaus said firmly. We are not staying alone with him for an instant. Mr. Poe smiled at Stefano, poured him a cup of coffee, and looked sternly at Klaus. Klaus, I realize you are very upset, but it is inexcusable for you to keep treating Stefano so rudely. Please apologize to him at once. No, Klaus cried. That's quite all right, Mr. Yo, Stefano said soothingly. The children are upset over Dr. Montgomery's murder, so I don't expect them to be on their best behavior. Murder? Violet said. She turned to Stefano and tried to look as if she were merely politely curious, instead of enraged. Why did you say murder, Stefano? Stefano's face darkened and his hands clenched at his sides. It looked like there was nothing he wanted to do more than scratch out Violet's eyes. I misspoke, he said firmly. Of course he did, Mr. Poe said, sipping from a cup, but the children can come with Dr. Lucafont and me if they feel more comfortable that way. I'm not sure they will fit, Stefano said, his eyes shining. It's a very small car. But if the orphans would rather, they would come with me in the Jeep, and we could follow you and Dr. Lucafont to the mechanic. The three orphans looked at one another and thought hard. Their situation seemed like a game, although this game had desperately high stakes. The object of the game was not to end up with Stefano, for when they did, he would risk them away from the Prospero. What would happen then, when they were alone in Peru with such a greedy and despicable person, they did not want to think about. What they had to think about was stopping it from happening. It seemed incredible that their very lives hinged on a carpooling conversation. But in life, it is often the tiny details that end up being the most important. Why don't we ride with Dr. Lucafont, Violet said carefully, and Mr. Poe can ride with Stefano. Whatever for? Mr. Poe asked. I've always wanted to see the inside of a doctor's automobile, Violet said, knowing that this was fairly lame invention. Oh, yes, me too, Klaus said. Please, can't we ride with Dr. Lucafont? I'm afraid not, Dr. Lucafont said from the doorway, surprising everyone. Not all three of you children, anyway. I have placed Dr. Montgomery's body in my car, which only leaves room for 2 more passengers. Have you completed your examination already? The preliminary one, yes, Dr. Lucafont said. I will have to take the body for some further tests, but my autopsy shows the doctor died of snake bite. Is there any coffee left for me? Of course, Stefano answered and poured him a cup. How can you be sure? Violet asked the doctor. What do you mean? Dr. Lucafont said quizzically. I can be sure there's coffee left because I see it right there. What I think Violet means, Mr. Poe said, is how can you be sure that Dr. Montgomery died of snake bite? In his veins, I found the venom of the Mamba du Mal, one of the world's most poisonous snakes. Does this mean there was a poisonous snake loose in the house? Mr. Poe asked. No, no, Dr. Lufont said. The Mamba du Mal is safe in its cage. It must have gotten out, bitten Dr. Montgomery, and locked itself up again. What? Violet asked. That's a ridiculous theory. A snake cannot operate a lock by itself. Perhaps other snakes helped it out, Dr. Lufont said, calmly sipping his coffee. Is there anything here to eat? I had to rush over here without my breakfast. Your story does seem a little odd, Mr. Poe said. He looked questioningly at Dr. Lufont, who was opening a cupboard and peering inside. Terrible accidents, I have found, are often odd, he replied. It can't have been an accident, Violet said. Uncle Monty is. She stopped. Uncle Monty was one of the world's most respected herpetologists. He never would have kept a poisonous snake in a cage if it could open itself. If it wasn't an accident, Dr. Lufont said, then someone would have had to do it on purpose. Obviously, you three children didn't kill him, and the only other person in the house was Stefano. And I, Stefano added quickly, hardly know anything about snakes. I've only been working here for 2 days and scarcely had time to learn anything. It certainly appears to be an accident, Mr. Poe said. I'm sorry, children. Dr. Montgomery seemed to be an appropriate garden for you. He was more than that, Violet said quietly. He was much, much more than an appropriate guardian. That's Uncle Monty's food, Klaus cried out suddenly, his face contorted in anger. He pointed at Dr. Lufont, who had taken a can out of the cupboard. Stop eating his food. I was only going to have a few peaches, Dr. Lufont said. With one of his oddly solid hands, he held up a can of peaches Uncle Monty had bought only yesterday. Please, Mr. Poe said gently to Dr. Lufont, the children are very upset. I'm sure you can understand that. Violet, Klaus, Sonny, why don't you excuse yourselves for a little while? We have much to discuss, and you're obviously too overwrought to participate. Now, Dr. Lufont, let's try to figure this out. You have room for 3 passengers, including Dr. Montgomery's body, and you, Stefano, have room for 3 passengers as well. So it's very simple, Stefano said. You and the corpse will go in Dr. Lucafont's car, and I will drive behind you with the children. No, Klaus said firmly. Baudelaires, Mr. Poe said just as firmly. Will you 3 please excuse yourselves? A foop, Sonny shrieked, which probably meant no. Of course we will, Violet said, giving Klaus and Sonny a significant look and taking her siblings' hands. She half led them, half dragged them out of the kitchen. Klaus and Sonny looked up at her older sister and saw that something about her had changed. Her face looked more determined than grief-stricken, and she walked out quite quickly as if it were looking for something. You remember, of course, that even years later, Klaus would lie awake in bed, filled with regret that he didn't call out to the driver of the taxi cab who had brought Stefano into their lives once more. But in this respect, Violet was luckier than her brother, for unlike Klaus, who was so surprised when he first recognized Stefano at that moment to act passed by, Violet realized, as she heard the adults drone on and on, that the time to act was now. I cannot say that Violet, years later, slept easily when she looked back on her life. There were too many miserable times for any of the Baudelaires to be peaceful sleepers, but she was always a bit proud of herself that she realized she and her siblings would in fact excuse themselves from the kitchen and move to a more helpful location. What are we doing? Klaus asked. Where are we going? Sonny, too, looked questioningly at her sister, but Violet merely shook her head in answer and walked faster toward the door of the reptile room. Chapter 9. When Violet opened the enormous door of the reptile room, the reptiles were still there in their cages, the books were still there on the shelves, and the morning sun was still streaming through the glass walls. But the place simply wasn't the same. Even though Dr. Lufont had removed Uncle Monty's body, the reptile room was not as inviting as it used to be, and probably never would be. What happens in a certain place can stain your feelings for that location, just as ink can stain a white sheet. You can wash it, and still never forget that it's transpired, a word which here means happened and made everybody sad. I don't want to go in, Klaus said. Uncle Monty died in here. I know we don't want to be in here, Violet said, but we have to do work. Work? Klaus asked. What work? Violet gritted her teeth. We have work to do, she said. That Mr. Poe should be doing, but as usual, he is well-intentioned, but of no real help. Klaus and Sonny sighed as she spoke out loud, a sentiment all 3 siblings had never said, but always felt, since Mr. Poe had taken over the affairs. Mr. Poe doesn't believe that Stefano and Count Olaf are the same person, and he believes that Uncle Monty's death was an accident. We have to prove him wrong on both accounts. But Stefano doesn't have the tattoo, Klaus pointed out, and Dr. Lufont found the venom of the Mamba du Mal in Monty's veins. I know, Violet said impatiently. The three of us know the truth, but in order to convince the adults, we have to find evidence and proof of Stefano's plan. If only we found the evidence and proof earlier, Klaus said glumly, then maybe we could have saved Uncle Monty's life. We'll never know what about that, Violet said quietly. She looked around the reptile room, which Monty had worked on his whole life. But if we put Stefano behind bars for his murder, we'll at least be able to prevent him from harming anyone else, including us, Klaus pointed out. Including us, Violet agreed. Now, Klaus, find all of Uncle Monty's books that might contain information about the Mama du Mal. Let me know when you find anything. But all that research could take days, Klaus said, looking at Monty's considerable library. Well, we don't have days, Violet said firmly. We don't even have hours. At 5 o'clock, the Prospero leaves Hazy Harbor, and Stefano is going to do everything he can to make sure we're on that ship. And if we end up alone in Peru with him, all right, Klaus said. Let's get started. Here, you take this book. I'm not taking any book, Violet said. While you're in the library, I'm going to go up to Stefano's room to see if I can find any clues. Alone? Klaus asked. In his room? It'll be perfectly safe, Violet said, although she knew nothing of the kind. Get cracking on the books, Klaus. Sonny, watch the door and bite anything or anybody who tries to get in. Accoid, Sonny said, which probably means something like Roger. Violet left, and true to her word, Sonny sat near the door with her teeth bared. Klaus walked to the far end of the room where the library was, carefully avoiding the aisle where the poisonous snakes were kept. He didn't even want to look at the Mama du Mal or any other deadly reptile. Even though Klaus knew that Uncle Monty's death was the fault of Stefano and not really of the snake, he could not bear to look at the reptile who had put the end to the happy times he and his sisters had enjoyed. Klaus sighed and opened a book. And so other times when the middle of Baudelaire children did not want to think about the circumstances, he began to read. It is now necessary for me to use the rather hackened phrase, meanwhile, back at the ranch. The word hackened here means used by so many writers that the time Lemony Snicket uses it, it is a tiresome cliche. Meanwhile, back at the ranch is a phrase used to link what is going on in one part of the story to what's going on in the other part of the story. It has nothing to do with cows or horses or any with the people who work in rural areas where ranches are, or even with ranch dressing, which is creamy and put on salads. Here, the phrase, meanwhile, back at the ranch, refers to what Violet was doing while Klaus and Sonny were in the reptile room. For as Klaus began his research in Uncle Monty's library and Sonny guarded the door with her sharp teeth, Violet was up to something I am sure will be of interest to you. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Violet went to listen at the kitchen door, trying to catch what the adults were saying. As I'm sure you know, the key to good eavesdropping is not getting caught. And Violet moved as quietly as she could, trying not to step on any creaky parts of the floor. When she reached the door of the kitchen, she took her hair ribbon out of the pocket and dropped it on the floor, so if anyone opened the door, she would claim that she was kneeling down to pick it up, rather than to eavesdrop. This was a trick she had learned when she was very small, when she would listen to her parents' bedroom door and hear what they might be planning for her birthday. And like all good tricks, it still worked. But Mr. Poe, if Stefano rides with me in my car and you drive Dr. Montgomery's Jeep, Dr. Lucafont was saying, then how will you know the way? I see your point, Mr. Poe said. But I don't think Sonny will be willing to sit on Dr. Montgomery's lap if he's dead. We'll have to work out another way. I've got it, Stefano said. I will drive the children in Dr. Lucafont's car, and Dr. Lucafont will go with you and Dr. Montgomery in Dr. Montgomery's Jeep. I'm afraid that won't work, Dr. Lucafont said gravely. The city laws won't allow anybody else to drive my car. And we haven't even discussed the issue of the children's luggage, Mr. Poe said. Violet stood up, having heard enough to know she had enough time to go to Stefano's room. Quietly, Violet walked up the staircase and down the hall towards Stefano's door, where she had sat holding the knife that fearsome night. When she reached his door, Violet stopped. It was amazing, she thought, how everything having to do with Count Olaf was frightening. He was such a terrible person that merely the sight of his bedroom door could get her heart pounding. Violet found herself half hoping that Stefano would bound up the stairs and stop her, just so she wouldn't have to open the door and go into the room where he slept. But then Violet, through her own safety and the safety of her two siblings. It's one's safety is threatened. One often finds courage one didn't know one had, and the eldest Baudelaire found she had brave enough to open the door. Her shoulders still aching from the car collision, Violet turned the brass handle of the door and walked inside. The room, as Violet suspected, was a dirty mess. The bed was unmade and the cracker crumbs and bits of hair all over it. Discarded newspapers and mail order catalogs lay on the floor in untidy piles. On top of the dresser was a small assortment of half-empty wine bottles. The closet door was open, revealing a bunch of rusty wire coat hangers that shivered in the drafty room. The curtains over the windows were bunched up and crusted with something flaky, and as Violet drew closer, she realized with faint horror that Stefano had blown his nose on them. But although it was disgusting, hardened phlegm was not sort of evidence Violet was hoping for. The eldest Baudelaire orphan stood in the center of the room and surveyed the sticky disorder of the bedroom. Everything was horrendous. Nothing was helpful. Violet rubbed her sore shoulder and remembered when she and her siblings were living with Count Olaf and found themselves locked in his tower room. Although it was frightening to be trapped in his inner sanctum, a phrase which here means filthy room in which evil plans are devised, it turned out to be quite useful because they were able to read up on nuptial law and found their work way around their predicament. That here, in Stefano's inner sanctum at Uncle Monty's house, all Violet could find were signs of uncleanliness. Somewhere Stefano must have left a trail of evidence that Violet could find and use to convince Mr. Poe. Where was it? Disheartened and afraid she had spent too much time in Stefano's bedroom, Violet went quietly back downstairs. No, 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 Mr. Poe was saying when she stopped and listened to the kitchen door again. Dr. Montgomery can't drive. He's dead. There must be a way to do this. I've told you over and over, Stefano said, and Violet could tell he was growing angry. The easiest way is for me to take the 3 children into town while you would follow Dr. Lupifont with the corpse. What could be simpler? Perhaps you're right, Mr. Poe said with a sigh, and Violet hurried to the reptile room. Klaus, she cried, tell me you found something. I went to Stefano's room, but there's nothing there to help us, and I think Stefano's going to get us alone in his car. Klaus smiled for an answer and began to read out loud from the book he was holding. The Mamba du Mal, he read, is one of the deadliest snakes in the hemisphere, noted for its strangulatory grip, used in conjunction with its deadly venom, giving all victims a tremulous hue, which is ghastly to behold. Strangulatory, conjunction, tenuous, hue? Violet repeated. I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't either, Klaus admitted, until I looked up some of the words. Strangulatory means having to be with strangling. In conjunction means together. Tenuous means dark, and hue means color. So the Mamba du Mal is noted for strangling people while it bites them, leaving the corpses dark with bruises. Stop, Violet cried, covering her ears. I don't want to hear any more about what happened to Uncle Monty. You don't understand, Klaus said gently. That isn't what happened to Uncle Monty. But Dr. Lupifont said there was venom in the Mamba du Mal in Monty's veins, she said. I'm sure there was, Klaus said, but the snake didn't put it there. If it had, Uncle Monty's body would have been dark with bruises. But you and I remember that it was as pale as it can be. Violet started to speak and then stopped, remembering the pale face of Uncle Monty when they discovered him. That's true, she said, but then how was he poisoned? Remember how Uncle Monty said he kept the venoms of all of his poisonous snakes in test tubes to study them? Klaus said. I think Stefano took the venom and injected it into Uncle Monty. Really? Violet shuddered. That's awful. Akabi, Sunny shrieked, apparently in agreement. When we told Mr. Poe about this, Klaus said confidently, Stefano will be arrested for Uncle Monty's murder and sent to jail. No longer will he try to whisk us away to Peru or threaten us with knives or make us carry his suitcase or anything like that. Violet looked at her brother, her eyes wide with excitement. Suitcase, she said. His suitcase. What are you talking about? Klaus said quizzically. And Violet was about to explain when there was a knock on the door. Come in, Violet called, signaling to Sunny not to bite Mr. Poe as he walked in. I hope you're feeling a bit calmer, Mr. Poe said, looking at each of the children in turn, and no longer entertaining the thought that Stefano was Count Olaf. When Mr. Poe used the word entertaining here, he meant thinking, rather than singing or dancing or putting on skirts. Skits, not skirts. Even if he's not Count Olaf, Klaus said carefully, we think he may be responsible for Uncle Monty's death. Nonsense, Mr. Poe exclaimed, as Violet shook her head at her brother. Uncle Monty's death was a terrible accident, and nothing more. Klaus had up the book he was reading. But while you were in the kitchen, we were reading about snakes, and reading about snakes, Mr. Poe said, I should think you want to read about anything but snakes after what happened to Dr. Montgomery. But I found something interesting, Klaus said, that it doesn't matter what you found out about snakes, Mr. Poe said, taking out his handkerchief. The Baudelaires waited while he coughed into it, returning to his pocket. It doesn't matter, he said again, what you found about snakes. Stefano doesn't know anything about snakes. He told us that himself. But, Klaus said, but he stopped when he saw Violet. She shook her head at him again, just slightly. It was a signal telling him not to say anything more to Mr. Poe. He looked at his sister and then at Mr. Poe and shut his mouth. Mr. Poe coughed slightly into his handkerchief and looked at his wristwatch. Now that we have settled that matter, there is the issue of riding in the car. I know the three of you were eager to see me inside of a doctor's automobile, but we've discussed it over and over, and there's simply no way it can work. You three are going to ride with Stefano into town, while I will ride with Dr. Lucafont and your Uncle Monty. Stefano and Dr. Lucafont are unloading all the bags now. We will leave in a few minutes. If you will excuse me, I have to call the Herpetological Society and tell them the bad news. Mr. Poe coughed once more into his handkerchief and left the room. Why didn't you want me to tell Mr. Poe what I read? Klaus asked Violet when he was sure Mr. Poe was out of earshot, a word which here means close enough to hear him. Violet didn't answer. She was looking through the glass wall of the reptile room, watching Dr. Lucafont and Stefano walk past the snake-shaped hedges to Uncle Monty's Jeep. Stefano opened the Jeep door and Dr. Lucafont began to carry suitcases out the back seat in his strangely stiff hands. Violet, why didn't you want me to tell Mr. Poe what I read? When the adults come to fetch us, Violet said, ignoring Klaus's question, keep them in the reptile room until I get back. But how will I do that? Klaus asked. Create a distraction, Violet answered impatiently, still looking out the window at the little pile of suitcases Dr. Lucafont was making. What distraction? Klaus said anxiously. How? For goodness sake, Klaus, her older sister replied. You have read hundreds of books. Surely you must have read something about creating a distraction. Klaus thought for a second. In order to win the Trojan War, he said, the ancient Greeks hid soldiers inside an enormous wooden horse. That was sort of a distraction, but I don't have time to build a wooden horse. Then you'll have to think of something else, Violet said, and she began to walk toward the door, still gazing out the window. Klaus and Sunny looked first at their sister and then out the window of the reptile room in the direction she was looking. It is remarkable that different people will have different thoughts when they look at the same thing. For when the two younger Baudelaires looked at the pile of suitcases, all they thought was that unless they did something quickly, they would end up alone in Uncle Monty's Jeep with Stefano. But from the way Violet was staring as she walked out of the reptile room, she was obviously thinking something else. Klaus and Sunny could not imagine what it was, but somehow their sister had reached a different conclusion as she looked at her own brown suitcase, or perhaps the beige one that held Klaus's things, or the tiny one that was Sunny's. Or maybe the large black one with the shiny silver padlock that belonged to Stefano.